Great. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to our lecture this evening called Attacked Healthcare in the Ukraine and Syria Conflicts. My name is Larissa Fast, and I am the Director of the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. It's good to see you here, and also those of you who are online. I know it's the end of the term, yeah, even better to be out here on a cold evening. I'm delighted to have a great panel this evening with lots of experience from a variety of different organizations. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Saba Bufked, who will introduce our speakers, but just wanted to say thank you to Saba and also to Andrew Gibson and Ivy Johnson for their work in getting this organized and bringing this event to all of us this evening. It's a topic that's close to my area of research, so I'm really thrilled to be here. Okay, over to you, Saba.
Thanks, everyone. I'm just going to be brief. I'm going to introduce the three amazing speakers. So we've been really excited. Sounds weird on the topic. Excited to have people talking about attacks on healthcare. We're going to first talk about the conflict in Syria, then in Ukraine, and then we'll have a talk from MSF to have a broader picture of attacks on healthcare. So I want to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Zahed Khatouji, who is also known as Hamza al-Khatib on social media. So Zahed is a Syrian doctor, a human rights activist, and a public health advocate. So he founded and was the hospital director of the Al-Quds hospital in Syria. He also co-founded the Action for Sama campaign, and they did a great movie that may be diffused here at Manchester. And he co-founded the Action for Sama campaign, which raises awareness about Syria and Syrian refugees, and he works toward accountability for war crimes committed by the Syrian and the Russian regimes. So thank you so much, Zahed, for being here today, and I'm going to speak.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for inviting me today. So thank you all very much. I'll be super brief, like an hour and a half presentation. As Laura said, it's unfortunate to keep talking about the attacks on healthcare now in 2022, and yet it's still very under represented issue in media or in politics in general, sometimes even also in academia. So I'll be a little bit general about the attacks on healthcare, and I'll draw some of my personal experience from Syria at the time that I was working there as an emergency doctor and a hospital manager there. So starting with there's so many laws to protect healthcare workers and health facilities. I won't talk into details, but it's since 1859 that's the first Geneva Convention, and then there was many articles and laws in the international humanitarian law. More recently was the World Health Assembly 2012 resolution, where the WHO formed their civilian system for attacks on healthcare. And more recently in May 2016, when the UN Security Resolution condemned attacks on healthcare facilities and personnel, and it was co-sponsored by 80 member states, which is very few number compared that we have around 220 member states. And talk a little bit about the surveillance system of attacks on healthcare by the WHO. For example, in the year of 2018, there was attacks on more than 175 facilities, 161 healthcare providers, and they can show the types of the attacks based on the bombing, shooting, even threat of violence, which is sometimes with academic studies is not very straightforward. When you take those numbers and compare it bombing of his facility and reported as similar as threat of violence. So that's a little bit kind of under-argument about how to report, and different platforms with different organizations, how they identify an attack on a healthcare facility, which is different from the WHO identification. Number of attacks in 2018, unfortunately, you see Syria has a huge share of those attacks. However, it's not only like related to Syria or Ukraine, it's happening in more than 19 countries and territories in that year, 2018. And then in 2014, we were introduced in Syria to the deconfliction mechanism, where basically it was offered to the UN system. It's about sharing the coordinates and locations of healthcare facilities and schools and civilians, like many facilities, to be shared with the conflict parties in Syria. And since the UN only deal with state members, so the sharing of those coordinates was with the Russian and the US, because the US has a military operation in North East Syria, while the Russian has the military operation in Northwest Syria, where Aleppo, my city, is. And why I want to talk about the deconfliction mechanism or any other health facilities protection mechanism is because when drawing on those mechanisms or when presenting those mechanisms, usually the locals are missing from, like their opinion is missing about how those mechanisms works, like does it work or not. Also, usually there is no accountability after those mechanisms. So when we have this mechanism presented to us, it was only that basically the UN asked through the OCHA, asked the donors, which are the INGOs and the local NGOs, to ask the healthcare providers, the local healthcare providers, to share the coordinates of the hospitals with them. And it wasn't clear, okay, after sharing those coordinates, some of us got like introduced to it as it will definitely protect your hospitals. Some of us got the feeling that you'll never know what's going to happen. But the main point is there was absolutely no accountability that if we shared those locations and the hospital was targeted, will there be any like accountability towards those attacks? 4 or 5 years of that, and the mechanism completely fell down. Many reports about almost all of the hospitals that shared their coordinates was targeted. And after that, in 2020, Russia has quit the confliction mechanism because there was an inquiry by the UN to investigate 7 of those attacks, where they found the Syrian regime or their allies, which are the Russians, responsible for that attacks. And because of that, Russia said, okay, we're not going to be involved in this deconfliction mechanism anymore. And what I want to specify here, as a local photo when I was there, as I said, like there was no accountability about this, and it moved all the pressure towards the local healthcare workers. So when we were there, we were just like asked to share the locations in order to be included in this mechanism, hopefully to protect your hospital. And then the thing is, it's left completely to us. And we were under the pressure if, like the question was, what if I shared the location of the hospital and then it was targeted? I might be like blame myself for my safety, my colleagues' safety, the patient's safety. At the same time, if I didn't share the location of the hospital and then it was targeted, I might be blamed because I wasn't part of this mechanism that was introduced by the UN. That was in 2014. In 2016, East Aleppo was besieged by the Syrian regime and their allies. There was 10 hospitals operating at east of Aleppo. 9 of them were completely bombed. And then Al-Quds Hospital, the one that I was managing, was the only remaining hospital at the city during the siege for almost like a month and a half. During that time, I had another call from the WHO, and they said that, like the guy, still remember, I won't say his name, I still remember, like he's an Egyptian doctor working with the WHO, and he said that we were talking with the Russian, and they said that they don't know where the hospital is, and that it might be bombed by mistake, and that they have a military operation in Syria, so they need to share the location of the hospital in order to be safe. And I was completely shocked because at that point, and I'm going to share some numbers of the attacks on healthcare facilities in Syria. At that point, there was more than almost like 450 hospitals like directly targeted by airplanes at that time. So being asked that by the WHO while I was under siege, it was like very, I thought we were completely doomed. If this is coming from the WHO, like this is their only solution, then there is no hope. And then I asked him one thing, if I share the location of the hospital with you, and in a couple of weeks, the hospital was targeted, would the UN or WHO statement clearly say that the hospital was targeted after 2 weeks of sharing the coordinates with the Russian government? And he said, no, we can't do that. And please, doctor, either share the coordinates or not. Don't put pressure on us. I'm the field doctor, putting pressure on the WHO. But this is how it works without accountability. The pressure went to the locals, and the whole, like UN or WHO or NGOs, where they have the whole like infrastructure, the whole resources, the whole funds, think tanks can't really offer much. One of the hospitals of Aleppo, we usually call them, so when we talk like on the internet or on talkie-walkies, the regime won't kind of locate where the hospitals are, was M10 in Aleppo. You can see normal hospital is the like lab, operation room, and in 2016, it was completely destroyed. In Al-Qudus hospital that I was managing, that was targeted on the 27th of April 2016, due to huge destruction of the entrance of the hospital and the main like 3 floors. Yet no one has were accountable for that up till the moment. I'm going to share with you the CCTV of the attack, just to have an idea what does it mean to be inside the hospital and be targeted by aircraft. So a normal day of a hospital, you can see some like a patient families are there. There was an attack in like 2 neighborhoods away from the hospital. So you can see people start like get out wondering what's going on or what's the situation. I want to also clearly say that in Syria, it's not that hospitals are targeted, it's not also for the civilians. They usually refuse to be admitted in hospitals. They say, just give me my IV drugs or whatever, and I'll stay outside because it's safer for me to take my medication outside. The staff start to empty the emergency room. One of the doctors you see in this footage is killed, Dr. Muhammad Wasim Mahaz. And he's moving downstairs to move his car from in front of the hospital in case any casualties came. And a few seconds, the attack happened. People were trapped inside the hospital. The main entrance was completely blocked. People from the inside, so from the outside, thought that the whole building is collapsed. People from the inside were trapped for 3 hours. There's no idea who's dead or who's not from the entrance. As a result, 3 of the hospital staff was killed, 7 were injured, and more than 52 civilians were killed in that attack. And what was the UN response to that attack, or just draw your attention about how like not random those attacks were and how casual they were. So the Physicians for Human Rights had done a great map identifying each attack and investigating each attack in Syria since 2011. I think they stopped in 2020 because of lack of resources. But in general, you can see that there was 583 attacks. Most of those attacks were responsible by the Syrian government forces. our Russian forces. And then we have 24 by the anti-government armed group, 20 unknown, 10 by the Islamic State, and 4 by the international coalition forces. Basically, like the important after that was like stating 567 attacks of a total of 348 medical facilities between March 2011 through May 2019. Nearly 900 medical workers are reported to have lost their lives in these attacks. And the total of 509 of those incidents registered, like more than 90% of those were traced to the Syrian government or its allies. However, when talking by the international governments or like the INGOs or the UN about those attacks, they always use the passive voice tones. They always use the tone of people are killed in Syria, hospitals are bombed, children are slaughtered, and then that's it. We have no idea about the context of what's happening. When we talk a lot with UN officials about that, they usually say that we can't really point fingers to anyone unless there was an investigation, like official investigation happened, which is a fair point. But you can't also just take away all the contents of what's happened. For example, like when the hospital is attacked by an aircraft, it's a different if it's a suicide cargo, because you will just like think who might have done that. If it's you state that the hospitals are attacked in a non-government controlled area rather than a regime area, they usually state that hospitals are being attacked in the whole of Syria and no one knows who's responsible. And we always urge people to hold themselves down from attacking healthcare workers. So those reports was one day after the attack about Ross Hospital, and you said like UNICEF and WHO urged all parties to the conflict to end all attacks on health facilities. But we have seen 90% of those attacks are responsible of one party of the conflict. I need to go very fast on that. There are so many passive voice ones on the reports. So for example, after we were forcibly displaced from Aleppo, giving only one option, leave the city or die. The UNHCR tweeted this: after years of darkness, city of Aleppo is lit at night, ignoring completely the war crime of displacing people, which is, I think, the third of the international human law, as like the people have the right to live in their hometowns. But it was always celebration of a small humanitarian win and removing all the context away. Same thing like everything, like when adults keep killing children, while in this one it was clearly an aircraft that targeted a civilian neighborhood, and so. Like this quote is my favorite. Like, if you're neutral in a situation of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say that you are neutral, the mouse won't appreciate your neutrality. I'll get it for you. Then in 2015, we were introduced to the new aspect of underground facilities because we need to protect ourselves from those attacks. And unfortunately, the UN funding stream and the donors funding streams usually are working by main streams or headlines. So we know, for example, 2013 was the maternity health year in Syria. And we had suddenly like 10 hospitals, 9 like outpatient clinics only for maternity, ignoring other needs. 2015 and 16 was the underground hospitals, 2017 was the mental health year, 2020 was the COVID year, and they always ignoring the local price for what is really needed. For this one, for example, when we were planning for protecting healthcare facilities and having some sandbags, for example, to protect the entrance of the hospitals, they were always saying that we don't have funding budget line for that. It's only for medication, salaries, running costs, but not for protection, because this is called under reconstruction, and we don't have the funding for that. So that's why I'm like just want to like have your attention there about how sometimes even the funding of the in conflict areas usually doesn't even protect the healthcare workers and doesn't prioritize that. Because depending on if it's like an emergency phase or anything under reconstruction, that should be like post-conflict phase, which is unfair for the local workers. The main points I want to basically draw out of that is there are many regulations to protect healthcare workers. they don't fit for purpose. Obviously, accountability must be an important factor in any health workers protection initiative. And neutrality in human work is important, but we really need to re-identify that. And I think a lot of academics are also in the aid field starting to talk about neutrality and what does it mean and how person is neutral or not. Funding health facilities in conflict need to prioritize protecting, do no harm first, and protecting the healthcare workers. And we always listen to locals in conflict areas. In our campaign, we prioritize this top-up hospital campaign. You can see pictures here from Ukraine, Syria, France, Germany, the US, trying to draw attention for the whole world about the attacks on healthcare facilities, and hopefully trying to start an accountability process for those attacks. I'll take a lot of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hamza, for sharing your talk. I have 100 questions for the while the slides are coming slowly, I'm going to introduce our second speaker. So we're moving from Syria to Ukraine, which is something you've been definitely hearing about lately in the news. So I want to introduce Christina Wille, sorry, who is the Director of Insecurity Insight. She's the founder of the Aid Danger Project and the Security in Numbers database alongside our director, Larissa Fast. So Christina oversees the organization of whole Insecurity Insight and Aid in Danger project. So her work is on using data to improve and develop human security, with a particular focus on monitoring and evaluation of humanitarian information generation. So it follows nicely with the numbers that Hamza was sharing in the presentation. So in a second. So thank you, Christina.
Thank you. And I just need to make sure I get this technology right. So is this working? Yes. So thank you everyone for being here. What I think we've already heard is an incredibly important subject, and that I think many of us agree is not talked about enough. So I'm going to speak about Ukraine, but before moving to that, let me just tell you a few words of how I know what I think I know. So how do we actually work monitoring? We have 3 pillars of our data collection. And the first is really open source. And without going into much detail, it means you have people sitting at computers monitoring what's going on and finding information in open sources and verifying that as much as it's possible through various methods, comparing it, triangulating it. We have partnerships with a whole group of humanitarian organizations who share their incidents with us confidentially. And we call it the Security in Numbers database because, as we've already heard, agencies are very concerned that they are perceived as not being neutral by talking about incidents occurring in conflict. And this database is a way of them feeding information into a system without actually being named. Do that. And then finally, we go to various databases and we cross-check and triangulate. So that's where the information comes from. So now to Ukraine. Sorry, yes. What I should also sort of tell you is that we work very closely with a coalition called the Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition, and we do an annual report with them on the attacks on healthcare. And then we are also a member of the Researching the Impact of Attacks on Healthcare, a project run by Professor Larissa Fast here at Manchester. So, but now let's get to Ukraine. This is what is happening in Ukraine at the moment. And there have been, since the invasion of Russia at the end of February this year, over 300 reported attacks that damaged health facilities. And you can see that here on the map, and you can also see on the timeline how intensive these attacks were at the beginning of the conflict, and each bar is a week. So there's only been 1 week so far where we didn't identify events, and it continues. And you can also see it's not equally spread across the country. It is particularly in the east, but it extends quite far west as well. And then this map shows you where the 42 health workers who've been killed just this year and the 29 who were injured, where this happened. And we've split this down by 3 different categories. The first shows us when health workers were in a hospital providing care and they were killed or injured while they were doing that. The second category are health workers who are outside a health facility. There may be paramedics, they may be driving an ambulance, they're out there pulling people from the rabble, and who are then killed or injured as they do that. And the third category are health workers who sustain their injury where they pursue their everyday activities. We have a doctor who was killed while she was driving her children to daycare that she could go to work. We have someone else who was killed in a bread queue. So, and that highlights, I think, something we've also just heard about Syria, because these health workers are not external people who are sort of moved in there and protected through some compound. They are civilians who are living everyday life in these sort of circumstances. And the boundaries between a health worker and a civilian is very blurred in these contexts. And this is something I think we really need to bear in mind. So I want to talk about sort of 2 things here briefly. First is the impact. So terrible damage and destruction, death, injury, but what's the impact on access on healthcare? And as I said, for the Safeguarding Health and Conflict Coalition, we look at many countries. And one thing that is really striking about Ukraine is the extraordinary resilience of health workers there. I think you've probably all heard it in the news, just how determined Ukrainians are in fighting in these sort of circumstances, and that includes the health workers working just incredibly hard. But obviously there is, oops, no, this is not moving. I'm not quite sure why that is. No, it's not doing anything. I'm getting some technical support here. It's completely, it's loading. No, it's not responding. Well, I can keep talking. We'll sort of get some images hopefully in a minute. So the WHO has done some sort of assessment that tells us on the key impacts. It's been more expensive. There is a lack of various key supplies. But what I wanted to show you, and I'm sure these images will come in a moment, is a little bit of what it actually means to work in these sort of circumstances as a health worker. And the images I'll have is sort of from the very first weeks of this conflict, where the health workers did something similar to what we also saw in Syria. They moved their patients into the basement to provide healthcare in these difficult circumstances. And what is really important to understand is how difficult the conditions are, and what impact it has on people of how they can say. Oh yes, you get the images now. So here, this is sort of what people treated from their work. And one thing that we observed from hearing these stories is that people had to take choices. They either had to go and live in these health facilities with their patients, or they had to stop working because going to and from work was just too dangerous. So what we also see is sort of a certain gender divide in the healthcare services. Those with caring responsibilities for elderly parents or children would choose to be with their families, where more male doctors would decide, or nurses would decide to stay in a health facility. I know of a doctor who moved his family to the West, and then he basically moved into the basement with his patients. And they obviously lost a lot of health staff to help them. So just imagine the working conditions. If you only have half your team members of working, and you're working in very different contexts. So that's sort of what it means to work there. And then there's also the issue of what it means for patients. You may have seen this picture. This is a woman in Mariupol in a maternity hospital. And one thing that sort of happens when healthcare is under attack is people choose not to seek healthcare services. But pregnant women when they go into labor, they don't have much choice of accessing healthcare at that point. And this is why maternity hospitals can be such sort of tragic locations for these attacks on healthcare. And this woman and her baby died. Here is an image of another woman who was in the same hospital in the same attack. And I've put this here because this is also a story of the other attacks we're seeing these days on healthcare. Because this woman was an influencer, she was a blogger. You see the picture up there in the corner of the images she posted of herself while she was pregnant, excited, waiting for her baby. When these images of her in this hospital went around the world, she was afterwards attacked of what we would call disaster trolls. These are people who claiming that the victims of terrible violence are actors, that none of these events actually happened, that these people making it up, that these are all fake stories. And this sort of additional attack on the victims of these violence is something that we're seeing more and more at the moment. And that's also extremely concerning because it creates an alternative reality of what is really happening. And this is what this woman, in a way, with her experience, stands for with this. Then the second aspect I briefly wanted to talk about, because this is something that we get asked a lot, you know, how can this continue? How can we have this permanent impunity? How do we need to talk about this? What is the work going to do to actually stop this? And how can there be properly defined crimes, war crimes or crimes against humanity? And one of the issues around this is so difficult is because we don't have a precedent. There has not been a case where these attacks on hospitals has been properly dealt with. So we don't have a legal structure to think about. We don't know how to sort of frame it. And a lot of people instantly start by asking, well, were these hospitals targeted? And I think we have a sort of natural instinct to ask for the individual choices in there, because I think we're thinking of these issues like we approach criminal justice. You know, I'm sure you're all aware of the difference between murder and homicide. So there the distinction is, you know, did you mean to kill this person, or were there just all sorts of circumstances that led to it? So that is, I think, how we naturally think about these attacks. And I think that's not going to be helpful. And one of the reasons is the types of weapons used in these contexts, because these are explosive weapons that are delivered from a far distance, it's 300 kilometers away. So the person pressing the button is not very close to what they're actually doing. And this is something I'm going to talk about in a minute. I think in many cases, they can't actually fully control what they're doing because of the weapon types they're using. So that's why this whole question of, you know, where's the intent? Is this person doing a delivery? Where can we find the person responsible for that? It's not really working on these sort of complex issues. So the way to think about it is also how we had it at the beginning under international humanitarian law. There are the principles against indiscriminate violence. And there are the principles that conflict parties should make a distinction between civilian and military objects. And there is an obligation to understand when the violence is foreseeable. And I think if anyone is concerned with how we should think about situations in Ukraine and Syria, that's sort of a good framework to think about. So why is it so important? Because it's hard to know which weapon exactly was used, because you need to be a lot of the military experts to sort of work that out from the debris that's found. But here, what you see on this slide, is something from a CCTV camera that caught one of these missiles, and it didn't get into hospital, it went into a shopping center, but it is something from which people could really identify what it is. And the key thing to take away from that is that the weapon systems used, they are, so there's another image of this, so this is how we know what it is. They are, oops, there seems to be one slide missing. Well, they're essentially indiscriminate. So they are built for really big US aircraft carriers, and they have some sort of sensors in there that go for the biggest building, but they can't really control where they go. So people using those cannot actually determine where exactly they go. But they know very well that if they use them in these civilian areas, they're causing massive destruction. And I think this is the way we sort of need to talk about this. So there is just one case where, from the limited information we have, we believe a hospital was actually targeted with a missile that had GPS functions where you could set the GPS location and it went straight for that particular hospital. But these missiles are incredibly expensive. We're talking $500,000 here. So these are also not things that low-level military staff can just take a decision on. This is something that comes from the very top, that these sort of strikes are authorized. In Ukraine, they're incredibly rare, as far as I can tell. In Syria, I believe they were much more frequent. And there's also some military experts who believe that Syria was actually used to test some of these weapon systems, and that they may have used hospitals because it was a great way to verify how well your targeting system worked in practice. But I think what we are seeing in Ukraine is that Russia doesn't have a lot of this stuff left. Yeah. So that, I think, is what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. Large-scale attacks, loads of things, over 300 attacks on hospitals, but in a way that those using this cannot actually control what they're doing. So with that, I'm come to an end here, and I look forward to some more discussions afterwards. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Christina, for that. And it was linking very well with Hamza's talk just before. So we're going to zoom out a little bit with Sophie now and hear about MSF's views. So Sophie Désoulières heads the Humanitarian Affairs, Operational Communications and Advocacy Department at MSF's Operational Center in Amsterdam. So thank you for flying in. She started working with MSF as a Humanitarian Affairs Advisor, supporting operations in North East Syria, in Iraq, Jordan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Venezuela. So before joining MSF, Sophie was a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group, covering Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so you're going to tell us which one now. Well,
thank you for having me, and I think this presentation ties in very well with the presentations that we've had from Christina and Hamza. So yeah, as Sava said, I work with Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, and we obviously try to reach populations that are not receiving assistance or denied assistance for one reason or another. And obviously many of these are in settings of conflict. So I'll be drawing from examples of what we witness and what we experience in Syria and Ukraine, but I'll also be drawing from some of our other places where we work. And so when I was starting to think about talking to you about attacks on healthcare and more broadly about the impact that it has on health systems, I couldn't help but thinking about our MSF colleagues, Tedros, Johannes, and Maria, who were murdered on the 24th of June 2021 in Tigray, in Ethiopia. And the reason why I bring them up is not to focus on MSF. It's not on some kind of macabre martyrdom, but rather because they're a tragic reminder of the fact, and we've heard it now, of the fact that humanitarian and medical assistance is not safe. And that the mechanisms that are designed to protect the provision of healthcare are simply not working. We've seen how 6 years after the passing of UN Security Council Resolution 2286, that kind of reiterated and reaffirmed states' commitment to protecting healthcare and the provision of healthcare in conflict. Well, it's not working. We're still seeing thousands of attacks a year on that are documented on patients, on medical staff, on ambulances, hospitals, and supplies. But what we're also seeing and experiencing in MSF, and Hamza's presentation also speaks to that, is of the criminalization of medical assistance. So in Syria, providing medical assistance on the basis of need alone. So we provide assistance on the basis of medical needs alone, hence in accordance with medical ethics and humanitarian principles. Well, that's simply considered a criminal act by the government in place. And hence doctors and nurses working for us and working in the Syrian health system, as we know, have been arrested, they've been killed, and hospitals in which they work, as we saw very vividly, have been attacked. In many states, what we're seeing is how narratives and legislation around counterterrorism are kind of hollowing international humanitarian law of its substance. So states are considering, instead of considering that a wounded combatant is hors de combat, so is a patient, and that medical provision to that person should be on the basis of need alone, states are considering that someone who is wounded is a criminal, and hence the doctors or the humanitarian and medical actors bringing assistance to them are conducting a criminal act. And that we're seeing increasingly in a number of settings, whether they're settings of international armed conflict or not. But when I remember Tedros, Johannes, and Maria, it's also because they're a tragic reminder of what the population goes through, right? Because it tells us what they go through in times of war. Because war creates new health needs that health systems may not be used to. It exacerbates existing health conditions. And while at the same time, access to care becomes severely compromised and remains so sometimes for years to come. So we've seen medical facilities looted. We've seen them occupied by armed actors. We've seen them obviously destroyed, but we've also seen them mined and full of booby traps. I remember in Manbij, in North East Syria, where we tried to, and supported for some time the main hospital in the city. It took months before that hospital could function again because it had been littered with mines and very creatively filled with booby traps by the Islamic State groups as it was withdrawing, severely compromising the access to care for the population of Manbij, but also for hundreds of thousands of people who had been displaced and who had arrived around Manbij. In Ukraine, and as we've seen, heavy bombing that has occurred, what we're seeing in areas that have been recently retaken by Ukrainian forces and where we now have access. We're seeing, of course, major damage in the limited areas where we work, because there are quite a few actors in Ukraine, but in Kharkiv, for example, in a very limited zone, we've documented 50 health facilities that have been damaged or destroyed and hence are not functional today. What we're also seeing is pre-existing health conditions that spiral out of control. And that's particularly the case for non-communicable diseases, such as diabetes or heart conditions. And so again, in Kharkiv, where many of the people who stayed are the elderly. They hid in basements for extended periods of times with very little access to food and particularly no access to regular medication, which and in very traumatizing conditions. So many of them became too unwell to leave their homes. Things were dangerous as well. And what we're seeing is that the war prevented them from getting hold of medication. The lack of food exacerbated their conditions because they couldn't follow their diet. The war provoked stress and trauma. And so this is leading to situations where it's affecting their mobility, it's affecting eyesight. We're seeing instances of organ failure in populations that have been affected in this way. What we also see, and the maternity example was particularly striking. We see this in every conflict location. People think that we treat wounds, we do, but we also just deliver babies a lot of the time in conflict locations. And in Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, just to name a few countries, what we've seen is how active fighting, indiscriminate shelling, the number of checkposts, sometimes very targeted attacks as well against civilians. They wound, they maim, they kill, but they also make it extremely difficult to access healthcare. And as we've heard, people make choices not to go to access healthcare. And very often, when they do so, it is really at the last minute. So populations, I'm thinking particularly women in Afghanistan and Yemen that already have difficulties in accessing healthcare are even more discriminated against in their access to care. And what happens is that when they do reach hospitals, it is when their condition has gotten absolutely at the limit. So we've had many situations of tragic, complicated deliveries that could have been completely avoided in other situations. Unlike many humanitarian emergencies, hospitals in Ukraine have been mostly able to kind of cope with the burden of medical needs that have occurred in Ukraine. But they're not necessarily equipped to deal with some of the scale of those needs and some of the conditions as well. So I'm thinking physiotherapy, the mental health needs that are growing, and the post-man's casualties. In Syria, as we've seen, after over a decade, the few facilities that are still functioning are struggling with limited supplies, with limited staff, and of course, with growing needs of a deeply scarred population. Booby traps, shellings have wounded and maimed. Many have been displaced. Vaccination campaigns have been compromised. Critical infrastructure as well, with regards to water and sanitation, has been destroyed or has not been maintained. And what we're seeing is outbreaks of waterborne diseases such as cholera, for example, these days, which we hadn't seen for years. So indeed, perhaps to conclude, war does indeed, as we see, severely compromise populations' access to healthcare at a time when it is most needed. And while of course it would be naive to expect that war wouldn't do that, I mean, it obviously had extremely negative consequences. There's a degree of, and as we've heard, of avoidable suffering, of avoidable death, if parties to armed conflicts would actually prioritize protecting civilians, protecting critical infrastructures and services, such as those essential to the provision of healthcare.
Thank you all very much for these actually very complimentary presentations. I think there is a camera issue, so I'm just going to. I think there's loads of food for thought, so we may start with question. Do we have questions on mine? Because I have loads, so I can easily start. Does anybody want to start? Yeah, please. Just as a starter, so just because also it's a very sensitive topic, just want to remind to be considerate and we challenge ideas with care and compassion. So let's just go for it, please.
Yeah. For the first speaker, you told us about how there's a massive problem with the UN and they don't take accountability for the hospitals, and how there's pretty much like a double-edged sword, I guess. If they do report where their location is, obviously it's a target. If they don't, then obviously they can't get the resources, and that there's a problem with how, even though they get funded, there's still some hidden costs or where it's misappropriated where the funds go. How do you see it? How do you see a solution to that problem? Like, how do you see where it should go, or the solution as to what the ideal situation should be?
That's a very difficult question. And that's actually what I was trying to bring in my presentation, that most of the pressure is usually moved to the local headquarters rather than like the UN with the whole funding and think tanks and people with high degrees. They can't figure this out, or I don't think they don't want to figure it out, because that would be like a very strong statement. I think, I don't know, they just move to the next conflict, or they just like deploy to the next thing, try to do the same thing again, and then it doesn't work. There is no actual like lesson learned process to learn from, rather than they just being going to the other conflict areas, trying to do the same and the same. But I guess, like as I said, like the important aspect of it is like always to ask, like what if the hospital is attacked and we share the location? What's the next thing? It took them more than 6 years to stop the deconfliction mechanism in Syria, and they actually didn't like announce like stopping it. Russia has just like withdrawn from it. So up till 2020, like for more than 6 years, they kept sharing the location of the hospitals and schools that was obviously bombed, and no one had just like said, like, you know, let's sit down and talk and see like if it's really good or not. But I didn't, maybe I'm wrong. So this is my personal experience and my like personal like point of view. But I guess there is no like really like learning process as a like lesson learned for best practices in the UN in general.
Yeah, if I could just sort of add something to that. I think the UN is trying to learn, but where they are failing at the moment is to do proper context analysis, because as Insecurity Insight, we share data on the humanitarian data exchange on attacks, and we put the geo-coordinates, and then we got this court saying, you must not do that, you're putting healthcare in Ukraine at risk. And we are now being, and I think this is the result of some attempted learning, told we cannot show that, and we must not say where in the country the attacks occurred. And where I personally get very frustrated is because I think they don't understand that in the case of Ukraine, it's not a question of their putting geo-coordinates into their weapon system and attacking healthcare. But then there is some learning from one conflict and then they're applying it to another, but in a way that it doesn't protect healthcare. I think it makes it even harder to talk about what's going on. So I absolutely agree. It's very frustrating how the attempts to address these issues are always lagging years behind of what may be needed.
Yeah, and perhaps just on deconfliction itself, it's an interesting mechanism, right? Because then, and Hamza was talking about kind of that impossible dilemma of sharing or not coordinates. What we've seen in other settings as well is that the UN system and sometimes parties to the conflict have used deconfliction as you give us the coordinates and then everything else is fair game, right? And also using it as you need to tell us all of the coordinates of your movements as well as part of the deconfliction mechanism. And if you don't, then well, we didn't know. So it's been a bit of a double-edged mechanism.
Yeah, so my question is related to more about the water treatment facilities in Syria, because I've been reading quite extensively about the conflict and I've seen, for instance, various parties contaminating the water sources. And once, let's say, the government takes it back, it's virtually sort of impossible to restore it. Or, for instance, they're targeting the water treatment plant. So is there any attempt to address this by, for example, IGOs or NGOs?
Do you have actual attacks on not only healthcare, but like anything that relates to health and healthcare?
I think that takes us to a question like why they are attacking healthcare facilities in the first place. The same thing why they are attacking like electricity, like generators or like power stations or like the infrastructure itself. It's because they want to make the area unbearable to stay for civilians, and then it will make it like an easy like basically then the fighters won't have anyone to fight for, and then make it like an easy development or progress. In East Aleppo, like we had the Syrian regime was controlling the main lines of the water that was usually cut. And then when the opposition managed to take like another location in East in Aleppo countryside, so they managed to control also part of it. And then there was an agreement that we're gonna like allow the water to go, and then like it will come to east part of Aleppo for 2 days, and then take it to the west part of Aleppo for 2 days. Then when the regime managed to control the whole countryside, they cut the water completely. There was a lot of programs by NGOs and local NGOs, like big wheels and have like the water, like put generators and like alternative kind of pipe water systems in the areas, which works for a certain time, but it's damaged the infrastructure and it's damaged like hurts out the water resources, etc. I don't know if you have any experience.
No, exactly. I mean, the thing is, the humanitarian actors are exactly that, humanitarian actors. They're a drop in the ocean in what they can do with regards to infrastructure. So actually, interestingly, yes, we in Northeast Syria, part of our work is actually providing safe drinking water to a large number of population with reverse osmosis systems, which are systems that kind of clean water and all of that. But it's not enough. Well, it's also pumping into scarce resources, and you can't make up for systems that indeed have suffered the destruction of the war, but also that have not been maintained. And so there's that entire maintenance issue that remains. But what we're seeing, for instance, in Raqqa, in the main treatment plant of the city, is the water coming into this treatment plant is cleaner than the water coming out.
Other question,
hi, this is Hamza. I don't know if this is a little bit of a comment, but I'm just curious. You said that you were kind of in the hospital manager role as well. I was wondering if you could share some insight into kind of like the ethical situations, obviously with provision and resource management and what they were like.
That's okay. That's an easy question to answer. Not because it takes time, but because I really have no kind of like clear answer. What I know that we weren't provided much of management training because that was considered as after not in the acute phase of the conflict, like spending to it. It needs to be after the conflict. While from my point of view, like it's really needed during the conflict, because hospital managers usually they're not trained to become hospital managers because of the change of the resources in the whole country. Even in Ukraine, I guess the same. People will just find themselves in that role, and they are not really built up or trained for it. So it's really needed for the conflict, rather than just waiting to do whatever you think that is right, and then we'll sort it out after the conflict to rebuild the health system or whatever. It's a little bit hard because to manage staff during conflict, because staff are risking their lives coming to work. So to be really kind of feel it like out of the space of telling someone, oh, you're late 5 minutes. Like, yeah, but like I'm really risking my life coming here. Or like before, also like circumstances of an attack happened in one of the staff neighborhood, they really need just to leave the ICU and go to check on his family or her family. So that's why I think like more funding for training as like a management for like frontline healthcare workers is really needed, which happened a lot in NHS for frontline workers during COVID, because they realized that it's changed the aspects of managing staff while they're also risking their lives coming to work during COVID. So I find it also much needed in conflict. There's a lot I can talk about, maybe not, but
Yeah, well, the reception just after you want to talk more. I think they're first and then. Okay, oh wow, okay. It's normally, yeah, go for it first, 2 and 3 online.
Yeah, mine is very quick. Actually, it's for Hamza. It's not a question, it's not from your wife that Morocco won the game. And people follow this question.
Good comment.
Hi, I think you mentioned before that the UN often remains neutral when reporting on deaths of healthcare workers or civilians in healthcare facilities. But that they, because they want to stay neutral, but they don't even report how they died. Is that something that they might consider, just even mentioning whether they died of airstrikes or not? Do you think that is something that we might consider doing?
Guess it's a data collection.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't speak for the UN. If you wanted me to guess, no, they're not going to do that, because they don't want to give the impression that they do anything related or even close to conflict monitoring. So if you talk about what happens in conflict, from that sort of perspective, you're no longer a neutral healthcare provider, you're commenting on what you're seeing in conflict. So I think that's the kind of mindset behind that. So that means the passive voice. It means not saying how people died. It means not seeing it was a plane rather than an IED, which kind of tells you sort of which conflict actor it probably was. So no, I don't think we see that anytime soon.
Online, maybe?
So the first question online asks is from Elaine, and in what ways is the way the people operate in healthcare settings changed during conflict?
That's a lecture question. That's a very. Do you have any short answer? Yes. Or shall we take the 3 and then have a group answer?
There's now 4.
3.
Okay. So then the second question is from Boris R. Thank you for the presentation. Could you tell anything about attacks on healthcare at non-Ukraine controlled territories, so-called TPR and LPR, if you were monitoring them? And were you just monitoring attacks starting from February 2022 or 2022? And if so, how different they were? Thank you. And then the third question is also from Elaine. You highlighted neutrality is important, applying the 4 pillars of medical ethics. Should then the doctor also treat any patient, whether an enemy, civilian, or not?
Yeah, that's a quick answer. Definitely yes.
was around when did you start collecting data overall?
Yes, so the question is about the different areas within Ukraine, and the simple answer is we've been trying to monitor all the time, but a lot has to do with access to information. And many NGOs are not able to operate in the Russian occupied area, and also the internet is all routed through service through Moscow, which means that ordinary people can't tweet or report what is going on. Newspapers can't write what is happening. So the result is we know very, very little what happens in the areas occupied. And we also saw what happened in Kherson when this was under Russian control. All of the servers were routed through Moscow. So there were people trying to get out with information. It becomes impossible because of the control of the internet. And I think this is another really important element we need to think about. Our conflict has changed just over the last year or so, because in Ethiopia, in Myanmar, also areas very, very affected, the government simply turned off the internet. And the result is you can't really communicate anymore. And I think this is something to really think about for Ukraine, the part that's in the Ukrainian control, Elon Musk providing the internet. But I think that's one of the things to think about, and potentially something where something could be done, because there could be alternative sources for communication, and then we would get better information. But until this happens, no, it's incredibly difficult to monitor in areas where governments control information.
Yes, it's similarly in areas that are currently controlled by the Russian authorities. At MSF, we bear witness to areas where we are with our teams, and we speak about what we see there, and we have not been able so far to access those areas.
I think just following up, just sneaking in one of my questions, because you've been all talking about neutrality, accountability, and distinguishing or trying to distinguish targeted attacks versus indiscriminate attacks. And so I've just been wondering, so one of the core elements of humanitarian are the Geneva Convention and kind of this idea that healthcare should be protected and that everybody should receive care and that countries need to facilitate that. So how do we explain that now there seems to be, I mean, I'm just wondering about your thoughts. It seems to be a shift in that kind of global agreement that healthcare should be protected in a sanctuary. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's also a multifaceted one. I was recently speaking to actually some medical students, and I was giving them an example of I was like an example of you're a doctor working with the American forces in Afghanistan. 2 patients arrive, a Taliban and an American soldier. Who do you treat first? And I was shocked to hear the majority of the room say, well, I'm paid by the Americans, I treat the American soldier. Wow, no, we provide assistance and medical care on the basis of need, and that's how you triage, and what is, and just this example to say that the normative framework in which we thought we operated is weakening. And there are voices, and they're very right, that say, well, you're living in la la land, like this normative framework, nobody really respects it. And so, why do you keep calling for the respect of IHL, international humanitarian law, so on and so forth? But I think if we don't, then who will, right? So I think we do really need to safeguard those mechanisms. But of course, as long as the major states that constitute this global order don't actually respect international humanitarian law, but also, as I explained, actually hollow some elements of it by through a kind of counterterrorism language and narrative, then actually, yeah, we are all at risk of that space being attacked.
I don't think attacks on healthcare are anything new. In 1871, when Paris was under siege, the German forces were bombarding hospitals then. The Khmer Rouge attacked hospitals across Cambodia. It has happened always in conflict. I think we are much more aware of it, and we think it is unacceptable. I absolutely agree that the overall space at the moment is shrinking. And I sometimes wonder whether it is because we've also seen a certain revolution of ordinary people taking to social media and other forms of communication and actually telling us what is happening. Because in the past, even 10, 15 years ago, we had to depend on people channeling this information. I had to be a formally trained journalist, you had to go through an editor, you had to be someone in an organization who agrees to share this information. Today, people can go on the internet, post a photo and tell their story. But this space is right now, in particular over the last 12 months, being seriously curtailed by governments understanding the power of it and therefore turning it off. And then we have this level of disinformation that the truth is being questioned and alternative truths being put out there and telling alternative narratives. And I think that's the sort of the really complex context we're living in right now.
Just add to that, like, yes, it has been happening since ever, but also the more that perpetrators are getting away with it, the more than other dictatorships and other countries will see, like, yeah, it's fine, it happened in Syria, it's happening in Ukraine, why not happening in Myanmar, why not happening in Yemen? Same thing with the like chemical weapons attack that like happened in Syria, and more were used in Syria and also other places, even though it's on a smaller scale. So without accountability, there is nothing to stop like perpetrators to have those easy wins over the like the civilians bodies. The same thing also about the misinformation, that when it's questioned about simple like shouldn't be even questioned about like where the hospital is location, because I need the front line. Maybe that's like what's targeted, or they're treating injured like fighters. If the international humanitarian law said like it's fine to treat injured fighters, while like with those simple things, these questions, I'm like, it's a different topic. I'm sorry if it's technical to anyone, but it's like questioning like a rape crime has happened, and people on social media are questioning like, was she wearing like what was she wearing, or was she wearing like walking in a dangerous neighborhood maybe, or how can we be sure about what's going on, or who has reported it, etc. It's really hard. And adding thing also to that usually when a crime happens in any country, there is like law enforcement or police to investigate what happened. While in conflict settings, it's then the victim's responsibility to prove that it has happened and to have all the right mechanism to prove it. We're trying to raise the law case against Russia about the attack on a hospital. And everything we're having, like, how do you know that it's Russian? Like, we know because it's an aircraft at night. How do you know it's an aircraft? I mean, there's Turkish radars. The US knows that for sure with their military bases, but no one is trying to help the victims with those informations that clearly shows who are the perpetrators.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a question.
I just wanted to ask, in the last presentation, you were talking about how you don't think healthcare systems were built to cope with war as much as war. Do you think that we could potentially build healthcare systems that could cope with war?
That's a tough question, and it kind of links into the question I think that was online as well with regards. I think healthcare systems are equipped to deal with a certain degree of catastrophe, but when it's coming from all sides, and we saw it in many of our countries as well during COVID, they struggle. I think part part of the things that change and so is that you're continuing to respond to the same type of cases that happen all the time. So road accidents still happen, babies are still delivered, grandmothers still have diabetes, all of that. But you're also dealing with mass casualties, with health staff who are personally affected and so are not coming to work anymore, supplies that are not arriving. And so you would need systems that actually are able to absorb that. And you probably have quite a few systems that are able to absorb the first shocks, but it's over time that it really takes its toll.
I want to add to that like usually conflicts when it's happened, like it's not usually through all the conflict that I've read about. It's never like a short period, like a 1 year or a couple of months. And even if it's ended, there's always like recurrent, it will happen again. It's the same like conflict. That's how they happen. And so basically just relying on emergency phase, for example, in Syria, now it's 11 years, that doesn't really work. So like a joint like effort of, I don't know, two mechanisms of funding to really kind of rebuild the health system at the same time keep providing the emergency is really needed. Now they start to talk about this phase in Syria after 12 years, which is like missing huge opportunities for many patients to be treated. At the same time, that mindset provided by the donors and the NGOs, local NGOs, to the local health workers, always put us in a side that patients should accept whatever they get. It's a war zone. Come on, this is what I'm offering you. And really doesn't like kind of put us on the edge to really perform as much as we can to provide the care that that patient needs.
And the other thing to think about is the mental health of health workers, because there's sort of increasing studies coming out now, just how difficult it is for health workers to deal to work in such circumstances. We've seen for Afghanistan cases where doctors self-medicate with tranquilizers because they find the situation so difficult to deal with. And just this morning, I had a presentation about the mental health of health workers in Myanmar, including those from Myanmar currently working in the UK, with incredibly high levels of depression and anxiety. So that's something that also really affects the quality of care. And I'm not sure that humans actually built to function in conflict. And therefore, I'm not sure we have a really great healthcare system.
We'll take a question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation and for the hard work. So my question, first I would like to support the fact that the is the one problem and having affecting the citizen access to healthcare, which is a fundamental human right. So from the same angle, concerning the access to healthcare, at what extent is the sanctions on Syria have been contributing negatively on people access to healthcare when it comes to the availability of medicine or medical equipment, etc.
So I don't think there's any contribution for sanctions regarding accessing healthcare, because the healthcare sector is burdened from the sanctions, including like medications and medical equipment and all of that. Yet there is an issue with the, I won't specify only the regime areas, everywhere, like the warlords that controlling all the aspects of the economics. So even if medications are really burdened from the sanctions, there are still certain groups are controlling like the entrance of those. I want to like highlight the always dilemma regarding attacks on healthcare with the access, because usually we always want the hospital and healthcare facilities to be accessible for patients, but the more accessible they are, the more obvious and easy targeted. And that's always like, well, we're more hidden and underground facilities, the more it's hard for patients to access. So that was always like a certain dilemma we had to live through.
Shall we? Yeah, I have one.
I was just wondering what protections are provided for healthcare workers from NSF and other international NGOs deployed in conflict settings, And to what extent are these protections extended to local healthcare workers while these international interests are present?
Good question. Well, so the way that we operate as MSF, so as we don't have a special treatment or special mechanism, right? The ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, had kind of officially mandated as an organization to document and implement or ensure implementation of the of IHL and the Geneva Conventions. So for us, the way that we manage is we manage by talking to all parties, by negotiating our access, by relying a lot on humanitarian principles and medical ethics, and hence on our putting forward our independence. We're very fortunate to depend at about 90% on individuals' funding. So we have very little institutional funding. So we're able to say we do not take money from governments that are taking part in this conflict. And that's hugely important to ensure our access, but also the protection of our staff and of the medical and humanitarian workers from the country working with us. Most of them are our staff, but others may be kind of Ministry of Health staff that we are working with. So, yeah, so that's independence, impartiality, neutrality, not as a posture, but more as an operating principle. Yeah, that's how we manage it.
Well, maybe just to add that your question of to what extent can that be actually provided to local health workers is an excellent question. And the frustrating answer is basically not. And I was also sort of reminded when you talked about the funding problems, you know, this budget line doesn't allow this and that. Those bodies that fund healthcare in conflict usually do not provide any funding budget line and therefore activities to provide for the security of local health workers. And for many, it's also a question of litigation. They are scared that they would be blamed if something happens, so it's easier not to do anything. So the result is that local health workers, even if they work in systems that get money from the international system, get next to no help in protecting themselves or their sort of services.
So just to conclude that talk, so you mentioned a few forgotten places. I mean, places where there's attacks currently happening. You mentioned Myanmar, Ethiopia with Tigray and others. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that? But also because we have some students and academics and researchers here. So what the academic community can do to support these questions for all of you, actually.
All right. Well, yeah, I mean, I think obviously in Ukraine for good reason is very much getting public attention, but it is attacks on healthcare are ongoing practically everywhere where there are conflict situations, are either international armed conflict or civil unrest, and I think it's important for us to kind of remember how they're happening, the multiple facets as well of it. We tend to think, and as we've discussed here, it's much more complex than that, but we tend to think of infrastructure being targeted rather than the kind of the full spectrum of attacks and menace that is on the provision of healthcare. I think at the risk of repeating myself, I think what is important is to remain cognizant of it. I think there's a lot to be done indeed with regards to understanding and addressing the similar but also different types of threats that healthcare providers who are from those areas, living in those communities, who have their families there, who are also at risk of criminal liability, or much more in the places where they live and we operate. I think we need to spend much more attention on that. Yeah.
Maybe just to add, if you find this topic really interesting and you want to find out more, I think tomorrow you can get some sort of information with various links. So every 2 weeks, for example, Insecurity Insight puts out a newsletter that has the latest reported attacks with links of where the information comes from. There's an annual report from the Safeguarding Health and Conflict Coalition. You can look at the NADS report, and there's a new one coming next year in May. So if that's a topic that interests you, do have a look at these materials. And if you ever wanted to get involved in some form, don't hesitate to be in touch. I mean, we always look for people who help on the online monitoring or processing some of the data. So do get involved if you think that's a topic that matters.
I'll just add, like, despite that, like, Ukraine is under the spot publicly, still the attacks on healthcare facilities is really not. If you try to ask anyone of how many attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine happened, most people will say maybe 2, 3, or I've heard about that maternity hospital that was bombed. But there was more than 500 in April. The last time I checked the WHO system, there was more than 500 reported attacks on healthcare facilities. Same thing in Syria and elsewhere. And it's always struck me how usually, like, it became kind of, it looked at it as a political issue rather than just general, like, unacceptable humanitarian issue. So, like, the compassion from other healthcare workers towards others is really absent in this situation. I would also suggest, like, anyone who's doing any work on academics, whether on attacks on healthcare in general, and any other topic, is to always try to involve locals and have the locals' point of view on stuff, even if you're doing, like, quantitative, just numbers, yet still there is a lot of the context can be drawn from the locals to humanize those numbers. And, like, lately, get involved. There's a lot of resources you can get, and in terms of advocacy or awareness, what we're trying to do in Action for SEMA, our main campaign object is stop bombing hospitals and the accountability about that. Look for us on social media and also find ways to get involved.
So thank you very much. I think it's about time to stop and have a break, and we can informally chat in the reception that is just behind you. So thank you very much.